I was at a workshop last semester, summer research for environmental history, and as a senior Deslauriers is a small workshop. It was really great atmosphere, intimate sort of voicing your mind. It was the first time I heard a scholar, graduate level, describe what they do as being post-disciplinary. I mean, clearly it's an environmental historian, but he still described it as being post-disciplinary, which is great formulation. And so I was at a book launch this past January, and short intro I gave myself, I described myself as being like an aspirational post-disciplinary scholar. People laughed. And then afterwards, just talking to people, two people come out to me, and one of them is a faculty member of the University of Toronto. She just got hired that fall, but she's a graduate of the History of Consciousness program, UC Santa Cruz. And I was so intrigued to meet someone from this program, finally, because I was sort of legendary program. I never met her partner, two graduates of this program. And we talked a lot about, she was hired in the Department of Political Science at UT, and how this interpretation of her training got translated into interdisciplinary formation was really, really interesting. And I think it came back to this question of practice, of potentially what forms of inquiry she's actually practice. And I mean, she obviously has a specific topic that she studies, but in a way I think it was what her training allowed her to practice and perform as a scholar, rather than, I think practices versus disciplines. Partly it comes down to sort of acquisition of knowledge versus performance of, I wouldn't say social function, but something that lets her translate that acquisition of knowledge into a broader arena, potentially. So it's really interesting to have that model, but potential outlet, I guess. People doing interdisciplinary scholarship, generally, there's a rhetoric within institutions that they want to foster these forms of interdisciplinarity, but then when it comes to training both undergraduate and graduate students, interdisciplinarity is actually really, how to describe it, I guess there's lots of breaks, both at an administrative level and at an intellectual level, in terms of really embracing more of that either-or scenario. The dissertation that you're going to produce is either one discipline or the other, something else. And you can't describe it as post-disciplinary, but you need to justify that understanding, I think.
Rather than being a post-disciplinary scholar, couldn't you envision yourself as a human science scholar with all the many fragmentations and degrees of diversity that exist and that are so characteristic of what we do, different practices and methodologies and research and teaching? When I thought more about our meeting today, on our last meeting here, I got the sense that what we're doing is much more than classics or ancient history. Those labels have lost their, even in my everyday operations, those academic labels have lost their, some of their meaning. I still do Latin and Greek, but so the human sciences that have the potential to bring us together again.
As a chair, I see the advantage of disciplines because you've got to have a curriculum, and so there are practical courses. But I think disciplines have always been very much in flux. English is a very recent addition to the curriculum, and it's changed both. Its name has stayed the same for about 100 years now, but what is actually taught within that, the nature of the discipline has changed. So, and I work in the Renaissance, which has always been interdisciplinary. So, Jonathan.
As far as practices, something sort of relation to what Stefan was saying about embracing the contemporary, and also something Kevin and I were talking about yesterday evening, which is that as scholars we have a tendency, we're working in a particular field, so we get, we write articles and we discuss with other people in our discipline. We use sort of like a particular type of language, right? Maybe very jargony or just the nature of the field. This is what we're used to. But another part of practice seems to be, if we are in this sort of transitional state, or we're in this sort of problematic state, has to be utilizing stuff like social media, because even if you don't want to relate your knowledge in some sort of like, oh, this present this manner, then at least get it out there, at least celebrate it, at least become an advocate for your field. And there are a lot of different models that have started to emerge that are less like sort of like problematic, like the History Channel or like the TED Talks, for instance, right? And those are kind of like glitz and glam, but those are places where sort of deep knowledge can exist. Maybe not like sort of that kind of jargon we would usually like put in maybe like a highly specialized article, but I think that's another part of the practice that we really have to embrace.
Yeah, Marguerite, when you were talking about the problem of inclusivity or exclusivity, sounds to me like you're thinking most about how to get people to the university. But of course, one of the other issues that you're raising is how to get information or how to get humanities strong within the university, but also outside. And if we're concerned with the image of the humanities, one thing that has come up a number of times, both today and the last time, that obviously is something to take into account. Whether it's social media or, as I said, there used to be a great tradition of public lectures at McGill, which we have in the funding just died many years ago. That we used to have big speakers coming, and everyone from the McGill community would come. From the Montreal community would come, so it was great.
I mean, something to be careful, I guess, with that form of public outreach or some of the social codes that they're built into those forms of communication, I guess, like the TED Talk, in terms of, obviously it's a specific format that they're trying to promote, how we can shape knowledge, how it should be digestible, particularly. Sure. It's not, it's definitely worthwhile to think about how we can create new practices and maybe go beyond that or
Become new celebrities,
Just sort of playing into this discussion, I'm interested in how what you're saying, Jonathan, is bringing these ideas into TED Talks. You need to sort of tone down the jargon and you need to make it more appropriate. I actually had a conversation with another English PhD student the other day about our different approaches to our subject matter, and both of us are sort of dealing with socially relevant issues. I deal with trauma and things like that. And she was very concerned about not using, post-structuralist theory, or not using too much Derrida or too much, jargon, so that it is accessible to a wider public. And I think maybe part of what we're discussing is what is sort of the limit there? Why make that distinction, or do we have to make that distinction? How much do we have to make that distinction? And this is sort of more of a question than an answer, but if we're both dealing with these sort of socially charged issues, and she's writing without this sort of Derridian jargon or whatever, and I am, is one of those more useful, or to what degree is one of those more useful than the other? Is that something we should be taking into account? Or even using the Santa Cruz example, there can be two students getting basically the same degree, one in English, one in the History of Consciousness, and one of them has no funding. And that's because of the approach. History of Consciousness department for graduate students has no funding, as opposed to for English it does. And there's sort of an approach or a social relevance factor involved there. What is at stake there? How are we defining this usefulness, and what does it have to do with the approach or the language that we're using? That was sort of a general question.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting question. I think if both students, one is using jargon and that one is not, are writing for the same academic audience, then it doesn't really matter. They're just taking different kinds of critical voices. But I think what you're suggesting is that the lack of jargon allows you to speak to another audience as well.
But I think the question is whether you can still have this social relevance or this usefulness if you're speaking about Aristotle, if you're speaking about Shakespeare, if you're speaking in terms that aren't necessarily translatable to your average TED Talk watcher.
I'm kind of worried about some currents here. I think, so just going back, I'd like to connect something Hans said a long time ago with, I think, the question of worry you're raising, and that is when Hans said, well, I also at dinner parties could say, what I do is too complicated to explain to you. that would be, on the one hand, quite a legitimate thing to say. On the other hand, whether it's the particle physicist or the classical scholar saying it, what they really mean is, I can't be bothered. You are beneath me in some, at least in this particular realm, and so I can't be bothered, which is why I urge you not to start taking that. So I don't think what we want to do is say the stuff we do is so elevated that it really cannot be offered to anyone outside the academy. That seems to be a terrible mistake, not just strategically, but morally, I'll say. But when you raise the question, you raised it in terms of theory versus not theory. I think it's incredibly patronized. I'm not accusing them. I want to be careful here. I think people who think that people out there, the person on the bus going home from her job in the cafeteria to make dinner for her kids, can't possibly grasp theory. I think that's incredibly condescending and false. And one reason I think that, my father came home from the shipyard every night and inquired after the well-being of his wife and children, and then sat down and read French history because that was his idea of a good time. And he liked his work in the shipyard. But my point is, there's nothing at all that prevents someone who spends much of their time doing, say, useful applied things from understanding some basic theory, although it does take some work on our part to impart it. I also just talk about jargon worries me because it's always, I think, a pejorative. Many of us, all of us surely, in our research have to use some technical terms because you can't be precise without that. If you can't explain what your technical terms mean, then it probably is just jargon. That we should be. So I'm kind of keen on us all holding ourselves to some standard of being able to explain something, not everything, but something of what we do to people who don't do it, and to people outside the academy. That's, and it's not that people outside the academy only want to hear the anecdotes and can't handle the theory. My point is, of course they can handle the theory. Right? We weren't all born with the theory. And it takes, of course, a kind of effort on our part. And there are lots of questions about the right venue, and if Hans is advising someone on the movie, how to get the ship started, all of that is, there's going to be a lot of judgment calls about it. But to think that this is not something that we could do or that we should do, I think is just a mistake.
As you were saying, Marguerite, I was very cautious not to go down the elitist lane.
Yes.
Very cautious there. The point, however, is to make it clear in advocating for what you were just saying, to make it clear that what we do at the same time is complex. It is complicated. It follows its own scientific methodology and conceptual approach. It's not arbitrary. It's not tree hugging, as I was saying earlier. It's complicated, and convey that particular sense of, or create that particular public discourse that is a little more respectful when it's turning against us than it usually is in many environments on so many occasions. And in that sense, your sister-in-law that has been quoted so often, my point there again is not so much as you were saying earlier with reference to my interpretation. It's not so much who is she, that is not the point. The point is, what are the true societal assumptions that allow anybody to participate in this discourse from this or that perspective and say, well, the humanities are humanities, whereas something else is scientific. And I think we should raise the bar there. And jargon is as you were saying, is at least a difficult word, because it's always pejorative. It seems to imply that we speak like the secret code language that we do to obfuscate our operations and maneuvers so that we can get more free time to do this or that. That is not the case. Those are our devices, our tools. We need them. It's our toolkit. we can tone it down in the sense that we can work with different toolkits before different audiences. But there is always a toolkit, and that is important. That is a methodology. It's a job, as you were saying earlier, Alex. It's something that is done according to certain premises that need to be mastered, that you need to learn and you need to apply. They're difficult.
I think that was one of the issues that came up with the anxiety or the uncertainty about the transferable skills, because the danger there is losing the sense that these are also very specific methodological skills. And we do want to have a sense of that specificity, as well as a sense of their transferable and their sense of.
I was just going to add that I think, at least from my own thinking, it's useful to think in terms of what we do, and I agree completely that what we do is complex. And in fact, the best part of what we do, I think, is often to try and showcase the complexity of the questions. Where I find it gets tricky is when audiences are expecting us to talk about what we produce as results. Because there's an economy of sort of sound bites. TED Talk is really, this is ta-da, this is the picture that proves everything. And that kind of link between what we do and what we produce I found is the tricky one. If a reporter asks me what are the most impressive results from digital humanities, I sort of feel like saying, that's really the wrong question. But of course, I also understand that that's the kind of question that maybe the readers or maybe the journalistic practice sort of expect to ask. And so I just wanted to introduce that very minor distinction between what it is we do and the complexity there, and being conscious of when we're trying to describe results, because in a lot of cases, I think as humanists, we're far less result oriented, and that's one of the things that we want to convey when we're participating in some discussions, is that we are there partly to ask another set of questions and to bring other associations into play.
Well, that pressure to show sort of results and impact, of course, is what we see pretty dramatically in the structure in England and the way in which research is evaluated. And to come back for a second, too, to the link between the difficulties that we're facing in the sciences, I don't know if any of you saw, there was an interview with Peter Higgs of Higgs Boson in The Guardian in December, in which he said that if he were looking for a job today, he wouldn't get one because he wasn't productive enough. Or if he were hired, he would never make his discovery because he would have been too busy writing grant applications. And I thought, now that's a really, that's a great example of where things have gone wrong. If that kind of research, which creates real innovation, produces real innovation, has impact, is nipped in the bud because of, I think, the term that's come back a couple of times, of short-term expectations, short-term goals. It's very short-sighted, obviously. So that, yeah.
This is unrelated, so perhaps you
No,
can
go on.
We've been talking a lot about professional obligations for people in academia. And I'm an undergraduate student, not applying to grad school, so I'll be, for all I know, selling office partitions.
So we're thinking about Aristotle.
After a small bout of unemployment or whatever. So I think the question we've been revolving around is what makes humanities more than simply an elite pastime, especially for someone in my position. And so I'm curious, and I'm going to press the question of what exactly is the obligation, what exactly is the contract that someone who studies, for instance, philosophy, who seeks to love wisdom, like how does that play out from day to day? How do you make that more than just a pastime?
I guess it's a question that I would want to turn back to you or other students. So again, I would just say that this is not a question that obviously plays engineering students. In terms of the social relevance, it's not a... Yeah.
I would actually have a problem with the very statement that humanities is something that is for the elite, because going to admit something here. I'm a big fan of George R. R. Martin's A Game of Thrones, which is a big fantasy series. It's been around since about 1995, and on the internet, a lot of interpretation has spawned, and there's a lot of people justifying why they like this character and that character. And I wouldn't say all of it is literary criticism, but there is definitely some parts of it that are literary criticism. And they really sort of encouraged my love of English, and it's encouraged me to go back to these, fancy tomes and close read sections and things like that. And I think that the internet has allowed this sort of platform for just sort of the common man to engage in this intellectual activity of close reading a chapter of the first book, A Game of Thrones, and having opinions on why you think that is foreshadowing or not foreshadowing, and yet not have to have, you are just an avatar on the internet, you don't have to justify, it doesn't have to be published by anyone, and it doesn't have to be justified, and yet it is still seen by thousands of people. And I just think that's sort of a connection that the humanities has with sort of the common man, and just sort of to interact with Professor Deslauriers' point on, sort of, it doesn't have to be exclusive, and so I think it's actually really cool that I can apply things that I learn about Virgil to this tiny epic.
Just 2 points, one in introduce, but my first point is about elitism. I think it's important to distinguish between pretension in elitism and love of quality, which is two different strains that often get conflated, especially when talking about the arts, is that it is okay to love quality and to search for truth. That is okay, and it should happen a lot, and it doesn't happen everywhere. My other point is that the humanities, I think, in how they play out, at least in my daily life, is that they're a way of thinking, and a way of looking at knowledge as a web rather than a stack, and where nodes come together. And when you learn to think that way, it affects how you see everything, how you make decisions, and how you interpret and interact with the world you're in and its history and tradition.
I agree. I agree that the search for truth, that love of beauty, these things are goods in themselves. But we've been sort of in walking around the idea that humanities involves some sort of moral obligation, and is there a moral obligation, and if there is, to what extent does it need to be central to part of the pursuit of humanities?
I think I'm not sure what your question is about, so can I ask? Because you mentioned professional obligation, and just now you mentioned moral obligation. So do you mean, is your question, once you have some training in the humanities,
Yes.
do you have particular moral obligations out there in the world?
No, that's exactly right.
Oh, that's what you put.
I mean, yeah, that's like the million-dollar question, isn't it? Right? And I mean, as somebody who used to have what we would consider to be a real job, so that I could pay for my degree to study classics, then suddenly you reach a certain point in which you can just study classics and get paid to study classics and keep doing that. And that's, I think, the transition between true love of humanities and profession, right? Because now I adore what I do, but it's an end in and of itself, and it's also my professional obligation right now. Where does your moral responsibility come from? For me, at least in my experience down this meandering path in classics, it's whenever you start teaching. Because then suddenly you're not forming your own mind, but you're forming the responsibilities and the opinions and the interpretations of those who aren't you and all those around you. And that's suddenly whenever, that's where you make the transition from this being an internalized passion to an externalized passion. And that's a very, very big difference, because then suddenly their approaches, their views of the world, or whatever tiny little aspect of it that you're teaching them are in your hands. And it's not just about you anymore. And that's, I think, where we get away from a lot of the selfishness that some of you as being inherent in the profession, and rather this is where more of it's almost like proselytization in a kind of benign way. But it's difficult. It's hard to reach that point, because you do have this elitist strand, right? And then you get into the academy and you think that's fine. But it's as soon as you start, whenever you're what you would be doing in your free time and your job become the same thing, I think that's when you start becoming a humanist in some way. And that's when suddenly the profession becomes more of a package with
Yeah, I came in a little late, so my apologies if my question has already been asked, but my comment is the way postdoc who's now transitioning into another professional life, postdoc in humanities and a PhD in humanities, and now moving on to another sector. I often, people would look at me and ask me, what do you do? Humanities scientist, and I think it has to do somehow with sensitizing or educating. There's an element of education that's missing, perhaps from the larger public, that we perhaps have missed. Everybody knows what a lawyer does. Everybody knows what an engineer does. Everybody knows what a teacher does, and other professions, an accountant, investment advisor. And those are easily quantifiable in the minds of everybody else, right? I think the elitist question is elusive, it's interesting, and it's related to this. Why is it that people still don't really get what we do? Professor, and if they don't, are we not responsible for that? Is it not partly our fault? Is it the media? Is it our cultural environment? I don't know if I'm addressing the question, but I am intrigued by this very much. And personally, I'm transitioning into the financial sector, and I have a PhD in humanities. You know, and I have managed to translate my skills, but it hasn't been easy. And yet we do real project management in PhD, at PhD. We are goal-oriented. We do leadership. We are focused. We are extremely detail-oriented. There are so many qualities that we have, and we are so innovative. And yet, how is it that we have to work so hard to make it translatable to a larger public?
Oh, Jennifer?
Oh, well, I mean, I think that's a very interesting question, and part of me wonders if one of the issues might be very simply that we don't have a kind of product that people understand. Because I think, when I think about it, because a lot of my friends are in science and engineering and medicine, and I sort of know what they do, but I don't really know what they do either. They have a lot of started in engineering, but when they come out with a microchip, I understand that this microchip does something. When they build a bridge, I understand that the bridge does something. And so I think there's that makes it a little bit more difficult, and it has to do with what we're producing.
Yeah. The productivity issue that we talked about before.
The productivity issue has something to do with it. It's a big point. I think you're asking an excellent question. But again, it takes me back to the level of the discourse. It's only the public discourse that seems to lead people to conclude that they know something about what an engineer does. But in reality, they do not know what an engineer does or what a microcomputing person does. And
they're satisfied with that.
But they're satisfied with the answer because it's productive and scientifically accurate. That's the point that I was trying, one of the points that I was trying to address. It's the public discourse. It's inherently anti-humanities, and you will have experienced this in many conversations as you were referring us to. But it's only that people think that they know about the other realm. They don't in their lives. Ask two questions and it's the end of the story. When people ask me what I do, and I do this in, I play this game with myself, just to see what happens. People ask me in whatever conversation that there is out there, in a long day in the world out there, and you said, you know, I'm going to do an ancient history of humanities. I'm getting like the weirdest questions. Most recently, I've decided to say, well, I'm in the human sciences. And all I'm getting is, oh, end of conversation. But also, really? So, it's all perceptual. It's the public discourse. It has nothing to do with actual contents.
Jonathan, this will be the last comment because we're over time.
Well, I think we brought up another question actually, so sorry for bringing up that, which is, why is that enough?
Sorry?
Why is that enough? Why is the perception enough?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, and some of the comments in the last little while, beginning with yours, too, have brought up issues that we need to continue talking about in the next session, which will be be on March 18th. But I really want to thank all our speakers, Hans, Marguerite, Rafico, and Kevin again, and the audience for participating, for coming out, and I hope we'll see you all in a few weeks then. So thanks again.